War Zone. Charlie doesn't announce itself. It seeps into you, through the soles of your boots, through the sweat that soaks your collar, through the vibration of 53,000 pounds of steel moving through vegetation that was never designed to let anything pass. The jungle in February 1967 isn't just terrain. It's an opponent with patience that no American soldier has ever been trained to match. It doesn't care about M48 Patton tanks or armored cavalry doctrine or the confidence of men who've never fought inside a green cathedral that closes behind you as you enter. It doesn't care about any of it. Staff Sergeant James Garrett, Jim to the men who trusted him with their lives, was 24 years old from Columbus, Georgia, close enough to Fort Benning to grow up knowing tank engines before he ever heard enemy fire. He commanded his M48A3 Patton from the cupola, head and shoulders above the hatch, the way a tank commander had to if he wanted to stay alive and see what was coming. He carried an ace of spades in his left breast pocket. Not superstition. Something a brother-in-arms had pressed into his hand the week before, with no explanation needed. His gunner, his loader, his driver, 3 men in a steel box, had placed their lives in his hands without hesitation. What Jim noticed that morning wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. The jungle had gone absolutely silent. Not the quiet of early dawn, but the particular stillness that happens when every living creature with survival instinct has already moved away from what's coming. He would understand what that silence meant in exactly 11 minutes. If you're watching this, you already understand something most people miss when they hear the word Vietnam. This wasn't just a war of helicopters and jungle patrols. It was a war fought by men with names and hometowns and people waiting for them, in terrain that tested everything human beings are made of. This channel exists to tell those stories with the accuracy they deserve and the respect the men who lived them have earned. Not to glorify the killing, but to honor the courage. Subscribe now and join the community that refuses to let these stories disappear into the silence the jungle was so good at creating.
James William Garrett grew up 3 miles from the main gate of Fort Benning, which meant he spent his entire childhood within earshot of armor. Not the way tourists experienced it, with cameras and distance, but the way boys do when it lives in the rumble under their bedroom floors and the dust clouds on the horizon that mean exercises are running on the ranges. His father worked civilian maintenance on post. His older brother enlisted in '62. By the time Jim turned 18, the question wasn't whether he would serve. It was which branch would get him. He chose armor because of the tanks. That was the honest answer. Not the patriotism, not the family tradition, not the proximity to Benning. The tanks. Something about operating that much controlled power under fire called to him in a way infantry never had. He went through AOBC, distinguished himself enough to make Staff Sergeant before his 23rd birthday, and drew assignment to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Blackhorse, with 2 years in country already behind him by early 1967. What those 2 years had cost him wasn't visible in the after-action reports. The first man he lost under his command was a 19-year-old from Tulsa named Pearson, killed by a penetrating RPG hit that should, by all statistical probability, have missed. Jim wrote the letter to Pearson's mother. He spent an entire night getting the words right, then threw the first 7 attempts into a burn barrel behind the motor pool. The 8th attempt was still inadequate. He sent it anyway, because inadequacy was all that remained. He kept the ace of spades because a crew chief named Rodriguez, who had made 3 complete tours and was going home in 30 days, had pressed it into his hand one evening saying only, "Carry this." When you're not sure why you're still out here, look at it." Jim had tried to ask what it meant. Rodriguez had walked away without answering. In the 3 months since, Jim had looked at it twice. Both times during the kind of night when the distance between here and Columbus felt like a measurement no map had ever been made to contain. Operation Junction City launched on February 22, 1967, as the largest airborne operation since World War II. 22 American battalions and 4 South Vietnamese battalions swept into War Zone Charlie. Roughly 1,500 square kilometers of jungle, rubber plantation, and scrub bordering Cambodia that the Viet Cong had controlled for years without serious challenge. The objective was to locate and destroy Coes Vien, the central office for South Vietnam, the headquarters that theoretically directed all communist military operations across the South. For the Blackhorse Regiment, Junction City meant something specific and deeply complicated. Taking M48 Patton tanks and armored cavalry assault vehicles into terrain that every standard textbook said was unsuitable for armor. The jungle around Tay Ninh Province was dense, cut by streams, crisscrossed by trails rather than roads, and extensively prepared with mines and ambush positions. Conventional armor doctrine called for open ground, clear fields of fire, maneuverability at speed. Zone Charlie offered none of these things and had no apologies for it. The Viet Cong commanders in the region had been operating in those jungle corridors for years. They knew every trail that could support vehicle weight, every approach that funneled armor into kill zones, every position where an RPG team could engage and disappear before return fire arrived. They had drilled their anti-armor procedures until those procedures were reflex. They had confidence based on operational experience, and operational experience is not the same as overconfidence. It is simply the honest ledger of what has worked. Jim had made himself a promise the day Rodriguez gave him the card. He would bring his crew home, all 3 of them, Martinez behind the gun, Kowalski loading, Williams driving. The promise sat in his chest alongside the ace of spades, carrying equal weight. What he didn't know was how soon that promise would cost him more than he was prepared to pay. Stories like Jim's don't survive in training manuals or official histories. They survive because people choose to remember them. If you served in an armored unit, or if your father or grandfather carried a job title that involved maintaining or commanding armor in any conflict, the story you know from the inside is different from the story any book records. The comment section below isn't just a place to type, it's where those memories stay alive. Add yours. Tell us what the inside of a tank feels like when the rounds start hitting. Tell us what the waiting feels like. These stories belong to the men who lived them. Understand this before anything else. The Viet Cong commanders who prepared defenses in War Zone Charlie in early 1967 were not wrong to believe what they believed. Their assessment of American armored vulnerability in jungle terrain was strategically sound, grounded in observable evidence, and built on principles that military professionals on every continent would have recognized as valid. Captain Nguyen Thanh Binh had commanded the anti-armor element of the K4 Battalion for 2 years. He was 31 years old, a career military man who had studied captured American field manuals with the same rigor that American officers applied to enemy doctrine. He knew that M48 Pattons in dense vegetation were effectively blind beyond 15 meters. He knew their main guns, powerful against fixed positions and open vehicle concentrations, were nearly useless in close jungle terrain where targets appeared and disappeared in seconds. He knew that RPG-2 teams positioned in concealed fighting holes could engage American armor at ranges where the tank's coaxial machine guns struggled to respond effectively before the crew repositioned. Captain Bin's plan for ambushes along jungle corridors was not reckless. It was professional. Position RPG teams on both flanks of anticipated approach routes, no more than 30 meters apart. Wait for lead vehicles to pass the forward positions, creating a crossfire envelope. Initiate with shots that had the highest probability of disabling rather than destroying, mobility kills, which would block the column and create confusion. Withdraw before American firepower superiority could be organized and brought to bear. He had run this technique successfully 6 times in the previous 18 months. 6 times American vehicles had been damaged or destroyed. 6 times American units had suffered casualties and been forced to alter their operational timetable. Captain Bin had no reason to doubt it would work a 7th time. He was not an arrogant man. He was a man with evidence on his side, doing his job for a cause he believed in with the completeness that only men who have given years to a struggle can believe. He had a family in Hanoi he had not seen in 14 months. He carried their photograph in an oilskin sleeve against his chest. He was fighting to go home to them the same way Jim was fighting to take his crew home. For Jim Garrett and the Blackhorse, the stakes of Operation Junction City existed at 3 distinct levels, and each was real, each weighed differently depending on where you were standing. At the personal level, his crew, Martinez, Kowalski, Williams, 3 men in a machine that required all 4 of them to function and survive. The psychological weight of Armor Command is specific. You cannot fully see what your crew cannot see, which means your judgment is the thing standing between their blindness and whatever is outside the hull. Jim felt that weight every time the engine turned over. At the unit level, the credibility of Armored Cavalry doctrine in jungle environments. The Blackhorse had been challenged internally and externally for projecting armor into terrain clearly outside its standard operating parameters. If the regiment absorbed catastrophic losses in Zone Charlie, it would validate every doubt and reshape how American forces approached jungle warfare for years to follow. If it succeeded, if its adaptation proved that armor could function in conditions previously written off, it would validate every argument for combined arms operations in difficult terrain. At the strategic level, GO-SVN itself. If Junction City located and destroyed the communist headquarters, it would represent the most significant disruption of enemy command and control since the war began. Intelligence believed GO-SVN directed operations across 5 military regions. Destroying it would not end the war, but it might alter the operational tempo in ways that mattered. Whether the Blackhorse Regiment could actually survive in Zone Charlie, whether armor could adapt fast enough to defeat an enemy that had spent years preparing to destroy it, would be answered before the morning was over. Captain Bin believed he already knew the answer. He had evidence on his side. The jungle had patience on its side. The only unknown was the specific response of 41 men who had not yet been tested in the particular way that February 22nd was about to test them. If you're still here, you already understand something most people walk past. That military history isn't about glorifying combat. It's about understanding what it demands of the men who carry it. Subscribe now and join the community that refuses to let these stories fade into footnotes. And hit that like button. It matters. In a digital environment where algorithms decide what reaches people, your engagement tells YouTube that stories like this one deserve to survive. The Blackhorse Regiment's story deserves to be heard. Jim Garrett's story deserves to be heard. Help us make sure it does. The jungle gave them 11 minutes. Touch came first, not the explosion, the pressure wave that preceded it, a concussive displacement of air that Jim felt in his sternum before his ears registered the sound. It pressed through the steel of the cupola ring and into his chest like a fist closing. His hands found the hatch rim by reflex, and in the fraction of a second before conscious thought engaged, his body already knew. The jungle had stopped pretending it was only vegetation. He was rotating left, trying to acquire the tree line through the smoke that was suddenly filling the gap to his 11 o'clock, his eyes pulling information from a field of vision already compromised by burning propellant and the close canopy pressing in from both sides. The RPG came from the left. The second one came from the right. Both went wide, but the overlapping explosions rendered wide meaningless as tactical information because his radio immediately filled with voices. 4 vehicles, multiple contacts, 3 o'clock, no, 9 o'clock, in the trees. Where in the trees? At the base, at the canopy. I can't, and underneath all of it, the rhythmic hammering of the coaxial machine gun as Martinez opened up on the tree line without waiting for an order, which was exactly correct, which was precisely what the training had built him to do. AK fire answered from 3 positions, maybe 4, the dry crack of 7.62 distinct above the heavier return fire developing from somewhere behind Jim's position. Through the cupola, the jungle showed him almost nothing useful. Muzzle flashes, smoke, movement in the vegetation that could have been fighters or branches responding to the pressure waves. The lane they'd been moving through, barely wide enough for one tank, had become a choke point the moment the first round was fired, and Jim understood in a single sweep that the Viet Cong had chosen this ground with precision, the way professionals choose ground. His useful field of observation was perhaps 12 meters. Everything beyond was green and specific in its anonymity, and lethal in ways that changed every few seconds. Diesel exhaust mixed with propellant from the RPG rounds, which burned with an acrid chemical undertone that settled in the back of the throat and stayed there. Cordite from Martinez's gun mixing with jungle humidity until the air inside the half-open cupola had texture, something between a smell and a taste, something the Blackhorse had a specific name for after contact began, though the name wasn't printable, and the sensation wasn't describable to anyone who hadn't occupied a cupola during a fire engagement in triple canopy terrain. The adrenaline response has a flavor. Not metaphorically, physiologically, the body's preparation for mortal threat produces a distinct metallic quality that Jim had tasted before, in 2 previous contacts over 14 months in country. He tasted it now, and his mind went cold and clear the way it always did when his body made the decision to commit fully to surviving everything that was about to happen. On the American side, Jim was making decisions in real time that no simulation had prepared him for completely. Advancing into the lane ahead meant potential mines or additional RPG positions. Withdrawing would abandon the vehicles behind him to the crossfire zone without covering fire. Sitting stationary made the Patton the simplest possible target for follow-up shots from teams repositioning in the vegetation. He chose the 4th option: traverse the main gun toward the heaviest contact, suppress with coaxial fire, and simultaneously use the tank's mast to push laterally into the tree line itself. Not the doctrinal response, not the training ground response, the terrain-specific response of a man who had stopped fighting the manual and started fighting the ground in front of him. On the Viet Cong side, Captain Binh was watching his plan function precisely as designed, right up to the moment it didn't. His RPG teams had scored 2 near misses in the opening seconds, within acceptable parameters for the engagement. His AK positions were keeping American infantry mounted and tank commanders below the hatch line. The sequence was proceeding correctly. What Binh had not modeled was Jim's decision to push the Patton laterally into the tree line, using 60 tons of moving steel to collapse the fighting positions his RPG team had established at the tree line's edge. It wasn't in any field manual Binh had studied. It was the improvised response of a man who had been fighting in this specific jungle long enough to understand that the tree line itself was his best protection, if he could put his armor inside it, rather than facing it across open ground. Private First Class Nguyen Thanh, 19 years old from Hanoi, was the loader for the 2nd RPG team in Binh's ambush. He had been in the South for 8 months, separated from his family by the same war that had separated Jim from Columbus. He carried letters he couldn't send through reliable routes. He believed in what he was fighting for with the same completeness that Jim believed in his crew. Not because he'd been told to believe it, but because he had chosen it with the same deliberateness that Jim had chosen armor. When the Patton's hull crashed through the vegetation toward his position, Thong stood, acquired the target at close range, and fired. The round glanced off the track assembly and detonated against a mahogany trunk 3 meters away. Both men were still alive. Both were doing everything their training had prepared them to do. The engagement shifted in the 4th minute. Jim got the main gun onto a small clearing opened by the tank's lateral push, barely 15 meters square, and the sight line into the principal RPG position was enough. The decision to fire a high-explosive round at that range and angle, with friendlies positioned as they were, lived somewhere between doctrine and judgment. Jim made it in under 2 seconds and keyed Martinez. The round hit both the primary and secondary RPG positions, due to a tree fall that altered the fragmentation pattern in a way Jim could not have planned and would not be able to explain in his after-action report. The contact on the left dropped to sporadic small arms within 30 seconds. The right side continued heavy but without coordinated RPG support, shifting from ambush to firefight, which was an entirely different tactical problem, one that American combined arms doctrine had been specifically designed to address. Jim moved his tank forward. The vehicles behind him followed. He was bleeding from a scalp laceration where a fragment had caught him during the initial exchange. He would not discover this until Martinez pointed it out 40 minutes later, after contact had broken off completely. He had not felt it happen. The silence he had noticed before contact began made sense now. It was the sound of every bird, every insect, every living creature with survival instinct moving away from what Captain Binh's forces had planned. The jungle had known before Jim knew, and in its way, the jungle had given him the only warning it possessed, 11 minutes of absence where there had always been presence before. He understood this now. He filed it away with everything else the war had been teaching him since Pearson. But the jungle wasn't finished with the Blackhorse. Not yet. The contact broke off at 0847, 43 minutes after the first rounds. Jim climbed down from the cupola with blood drying along his right temple and a shaking in his hands that he would not acknowledge to anyone but himself. Martinez was laughing, not at anything specific, just the post-contact laughter of men who have processed mortal threat and come through the other side surprised to be intact. Kowalski was checking the track assembly where the RPG round had deflected, running his hands along the steel the way a man checks a limb after a near miss, needing to touch what survived. Williams had the hatch up and was drinking water in long pulls, forehead pressed against the cool metal of the hull. Jim pulled the ace of spades from his breast pocket. He didn't study it long enough to note that it was still there, unchanged by what had happened. Long enough to think about Rodriguez, who was probably stateside by now, probably sitting somewhere with a beer and a television set, in a world where this morning was a newspaper story rather than a memory that would be in his chest every day for years. He put the card back. 200 meters through the tree line, Captain Binh was doing his own accounting. He had lost 4 men. He was reorganizing, assessing, preparing to adapt his secondary positions. He was doing his job, the same as Jim. Both of them were professionals. Both of them were going to make the next decision the same way they had made the last one, with the information available, in the time allowed. The orders that reached Jim at 09:15 were operationally clear in the way that makes field commanders wish for follow-up questions. The Blackhorse had located what S2 assessed as a significant Viet Cong logistics node, a network of underground bunkers and supply caches approximately 600 meters east of the contact point. S2 assessed the position as lightly defended, based on the fire volume during the initial engagement. Orders were to push in, secure the complex, and hold for infantry exploitation. 600 meters into jungle that had just demonstrated its willingness to absorb ambush teams without visible signature. Into terrain that Captain Binh's remaining forces knew the dimensions of, because they had built their engagement around it. And Jim's track had a cracked link that Williams had identified during the post-contact inspection. Functional, probably for the push-in. Less certainly functional for rapid extraction if the complex turned out to be something other than lightly defended. There were 3 options. Push in now, 4 vehicles, known route, enemy with full awareness of that route, cracked track link. Wait 45 minutes for the infantry battalion. But the intelligence window on the logistics node had a timestamp, and 45 minutes would exceed it. Or report the track damage, request a replacement vehicle, hold position, which meant a minimum 45-minute delay and a cold target. Command wanted the node. Command had good reasons for wanting the node. The men in the 3 vehicles behind Jim were waiting. Williams had told him about the track link and then said nothing else. Waiting, not pushing, the way a driver does with a commander he trusts to make the correct call. What would you do? Not in a classroom. Not with time to write a memorandum or consult a manual. Right now, you have a cracked track link that might hold through 600 meters of jungle terrain and might not. You have an enemy who knows your approach route better than you do. You have intelligence that says lightly defended and field experience that says intelligence is a best estimate, not a guarantee. You have 3 vehicles behind you with 12 men whose lives depend on your assessment of a mechanical failure you can see but not predict. You have orders that are clear and objective and necessarily silent on the factors that make the objective dangerous. You have 43 minutes of combat in your immediate memory and a fragment wound in your scalp you haven't fully processed. What do you do? How long do you take? Do you call for clarification, knowing that clarification takes time the window doesn't have? Or is this, in the specific terrain, with the specific information available only to the man in the cupola, a decision that belongs here, right now, with you? You made a promise to bring 3 men home. That promise and this order are about to run into each other. What do you do when there's no answer that doesn't carry a cost you can't calculate in advance? Jim had 90 seconds before he had to key his radio. He ordered the push, not solely because command wanted the node, because the 3 other vehicles had 14 men between them and remaining on the approach route with a damaged track while Binh's forces reorganized increased the probability of a second engagement on ground they no longer controlled. It was a calculation made from incomplete information, under conditions no algorithm could replicate, by a 24-year-old man from Columbus, Georgia, who had been training for this his entire adult life, and still wasn't certain he was right. He keyed the radio, gave the order, heard the vehicles behind him begin to move. The jungle received them with its characteristic silence, and Jim understood by now that jungle silence was assessment, not peace. The promise he had made, all three of them home, had just become harder. A cracked track link moving through enemy reorganized terrain on a compromised approach route was the kind of variable that promises ran into. Rodriguez had said to carry the card. He hadn't specified what carrying it through would look like. The choice was made. The consequences were just beginning. The Viet Cong had prepared secondary positions. Captain Binh was a thorough professional, and thoroughness required contingencies. He had read the terrain correctly in his initial ambush setup. He had also prepared for the scenario where American armor survived the first engagement and attempted to push deeper, because pushing deeper was the American doctrinal response to contact, and Binh had studied American doctrine long enough to anticipate it. The secondary positions were established at the bunker complex perimeter, in a defensive configuration designed to stop armor at the entrance, while RPG teams engaged from concealed positions within the complex's above-ground support structures. Jim's column entered the secondary engagement zone at 0952, 580 meters into the jungle, and the contact was immediate and heavy. 2 RPG rounds impacted within 4 seconds of the first AK burst, one against the front slope of Jim's tank, one against the left track assembly of the second vehicle in column. The second tank stopped. Track damage, definitive this time. The column was now in a compressed lane with one immobilized vehicle blocking the return route, one functional vehicle forward, and 2 vehicles behind the immobilized one that could not push past it. This was the scenario Captain Binh had designed for. This was the moment where his ambush doctrine should have converted the tactical success of immobilization into the operational success of isolation and destruction. His RPG teams were positioned. His AK elements were suppressing effectively, keeping American commanders below the hatch line, degrading their observation and their coordination. The next 60 seconds in Binh's model were the point where American armor admitted defeat. What happened instead was the Blackhorse, not as a concept, not as regimental history, as the specific men in those vehicles who had trained for combined arms operations under exactly these conditions, who had internalized the particular culture of a regiment that understood an immobilized tank was not a dead tank and a compressed column was not a destroyed column. What happened was 12 men doing their jobs under direct fire in jungle terrain as precisely as human beings under mortal stress can do anything at all, which is more precisely than anyone who hasn't been there would believe. Jim brought his main gun onto the bunker complex entrance, while simultaneously directing the 4th vehicle to push forward along the right edge of the lane, creating a partial flanking angle that the jungle's density made imperfect but usable. The 3rd vehicle, behind the immobilized tank, used its M60 to cover the left approach and prevent Binh's forces from moving additional RPG elements into the rear of the column. It wasn't clean. Doctrine would not have fully recognized it. It was the fighting of men who had stopped referencing the manual and started problem solving with the specific assets available in the specific terrain in front of them, right now, with no better options in reserve. Martinez fired 4 main gun rounds in 6 minutes, not for destruction alone, but for terrain disruption, using the concussive force of a 105mm round to collapse vegetation and deny Binh's forces the concealment positions their ambush required. Each round changed the ground. Each changed ground forced Binh's fighters to adjust. Each adjustment took time, and time was the resource the Blackhorse was buying with every exchange, in the only currency available. Williams, from the driver's station of the immobilized vehicle, Jim had moved to direct the recovery, was coordinating the track repair under fire with a calm that Jim would describe in his after-action report as professional excellence under adverse conditions. Williams had a wife in Louisville and a daughter 14 months old who was learning to walk while her father repaired a cracked track link in jungle terrain with incoming small arms impacting the hull every 90 seconds. He didn't stop. He kept working because stopping was not one of the available options, and because the men in the vehicles behind him were waiting on that track to move. It wasn't about firepower. It wasn't even about armor. It was about refusing to accept as final a situation that wasn't final yet, in conditions that all available evidence said should have broken them before it got this far. The Blackhorse Regiment had internalized something in its institutional culture that didn't appear in field manuals and couldn't be assessed in training exercises: the refusal to perform the calculation that said this was over. That refusal, in that jungle on that morning, was the game changer. Captain Binh made his decision at approximately 0:10:17. The secondary engagement had lasted 25 minutes, far beyond the model's projection for the isolation and destruction phase. His RPG teams had expended significant ammunition. 3 more fighters were down, bringing the day's total losses to 7, each man with a name, a home province, a reason for being there as specific and personal as any reason Jim carried. American armor had not been destroyed. The column was recovering its immobilized vehicle rather than abandoning it, which was the response Binh's model had identified as unlikely. Binh gave the order to break contact and withdraw to tertiary positions, not retreat. Withdraw. There is a professional difference, and he was a professional. He had damaged American armor. He had demonstrated vulnerability. He had inflicted casualties. His tactical objectives for the day were partially achieved. His force had taken unsustainable losses pursuing full achievement. He made the rational decision, and he made it without flinching, the same way Jim had made his decisions all morning. Private Thang withdrew with his element, carrying the RPG that had deflected off Jim's track assembly 4 hours earlier. He was alive. He was functional. He had served with skill and courage under conditions that had killed men beside him. 20 minutes into the withdrawal, moving through jungle both armies would contest for another 8 years, he paused and wrote a letter to his family. He couldn't send it reliably. He wrote it anyway. The logistics node was reached, secured, documented. Intelligence confirmed 16 months of accumulated material: weapons, munitions, medical supplies, operational documents that would take S2 teams 3 days to process. 3 South Vietnamese battalions exploited the intelligence over the following week. It was not the destruction of Co-SVN. It was not the strategic breakthrough that Operation Junction City had promised. But the Blackhorse had proved something in that jungle corridor that no report would fully capture. That armor adapted. That men adapted. And that the jungle, for all its patience and professional confidence, did not always get the final word. Victory had come, but the cost was still being counted. The Blackhorse Regiment's casualties for the day were 3 dead and 11 wounded. Specialist Raymond Torres, 21 years old, from San Antonio, Texas. He had been in country for 6 weeks, assigned to the supporting infantry element, and he died of fragment wounds in the secondary engagement before any medic could reach him. He had written his mother a letter 4 days before contact telling her the unit was good, that the people were professional, that he was learning fast. He had sealed it and given it to the mail runner the morning of the 22nd. His mother would receive it after the telegram. Staff Sergeant Paul Nakamura, 27, from Honolulu, Hawaii. 2 tours. a wife, 2 sons, and a 3rd child he would never see born. He died in the crew position of the 2nd vehicle during the secondary engagement, when a burst of automatic fire found the gap between the hatch and the commander's ring. He was the kind of sergeant units do not easily replace: the institutional memory, the voice that translated between officer intention and enlisted execution, the man who already had a solution to the problem that hadn't been asked yet. Private First Class Danny Boyle, 19, from Albuquerque, New Mexico, 8 months in country, a photograph of his sister and a paperback Western novel. 3/4 read that would never be finished. He died doing his job. On the Viet Cong side, 7 fighters were confirmed killed. Each had a name, each had a province, each had a family receiving news through networks that did not include Western Union. Nguyen Van Son, the oldest of Binh's fighters, was 43 and had been fighting since the French were still in the country. Tran Duc Long was 17 and had arrived from the north 6 weeks before Torres arrived from San Antonio. They were not enemies in any sense that explained the distance between their lives. They were men who ended up on opposite sides of the same jungle corridor on the same morning. The jungle after contact has a quality that no training environment replicates. The sounds return incrementally, not in a rush, but in layers, as if the ecosystem is testing whether the violence has genuinely stopped. First the insects, then birds from a distance, then closer birds who are bolder, then the full chorus of a jungle that has absorbed another morning of war and filed it alongside everything else absorbed over centuries of being exactly what it is and refusing to apologize for any of it. Jim sat on the hull of his tank at 11:40 and tried to process the 7 hours since 0400. He was not succeeding in the way that process implies movement. He was sitting. The scalp laceration had been dressed by the medic with butterfly closures and a comment about how much scalp wounds bleed relative to their actual severity, which Jim had found technically accurate and comprehensively unhelpful. The ace of spades was in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out. He was looking at it without seeing it, which was different from both previous times he had looked at it. Those times, he had been searching for something. This time he was just holding it while his mind went to a place his hands couldn't follow. Torres's unit was loading him for transport. The sound of that, men carrying weight with care, in silence, with grief as the only audible register, was the sound of the morning's worst inheritance. Williams came and sat beside Jim without speaking. Kowalski checked something on the engine deck that did not need checking. Martinez stayed at his gun position past the point of necessity because his gun position was somewhere to be. Something had been filed away during the contact, not consciously, not the way decisions are made, but the way experience accumulates in a person over months of combat, until the person who started the tour is no longer fully recoverable. Jim had made the call to push into the secondary position. He had made it correctly by every standard available to him at the time. Torres had died because of what the push encountered. These two things were simultaneously true, and the space between them was the specific interior architecture that veterans carry without always having language for. Captain Binh, withdrawing through jungle 2 kilometers to the west, was conducting his own accounting. 7 dead, the node lost, his ambush doctrine requiring revision based on what the Blackhorse had demonstrated. He grieved with the efficiency that professional soldiers develop, fully in the moment, then filed, because the war did not pause for grief from either side of the corridor. Jim put the ace of spades away. The card had been in Rodriguez's pocket through whatever Rodriguez had been through. Rodriguez had given it forward. Jim had carried it through this morning. Torres had carried a letter in his breast pocket that was now traveling toward a woman in San Antonio who was waiting for her son. The card was unchanged. Everything else was. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years. And the weight never got lighter. Jim Garrett completed his tour with the Blackhorse and returned to Columbus, Georgia in August of 1967. He stayed in the Army for 3 more years, then left, then re-enlisted, then left again. The particular oscillation of a man who couldn't locate himself outside the structure that had formed him, while still deciding whether that structure was something he wanted to keep. He eventually settled outside Columbus, within sight of the Benning tree line on clear days, and worked civilian defense contracting for 2 decades. He couldn't hear close thunderstorms without what he called difficulty. He never explained to people who hadn't been in country what difficulty meant, because the explanation required context that couldn't survive compression into conversation. He had 3 children who knew their father had served in the Blackhorse, who knew fragments of the story in the way fathers share fragments. The larger pieces stayed where they had been filed. He kept the ace of spades in a tin box on the top shelf of his study closet. He moved it once during a repaint and moved it back. He did not open the box often. He opened it sometimes. The card was unchanged, the same card Rodriguez had pressed into his hand in '66, the same card that had been in his breast pocket through the morning of February 22nd and through 30 more months of service afterward. It still meant what Rodriguez had meant it to mean. Jim had taken approximately 15 years to fully understand what that was. Jim Garrett served honorably. The men under his command served honorably. Torres, Nakamura, Boyle, they served honorably. And Captain Bin's fighters, those young men on the other side of the jungle corridor who had prepared their positions with professional care and believed in their cause with the same completeness that Jim believed in his crew. They served honorably too. They all did what they believed was right, with courage and skill that deserves recognition without qualification. The fault, where there was fault, lay elsewhere. It lay in a strategic architecture that sent armor into terrain doctrine considered unsuitable without fully addressing why. It lay in an operational framework that measured success in body counts rather than political outcomes. It lay in decisions made in Washington and Saigon by men who understood the theory of the war far better than they understood its terrain, and who would not be sitting on a tank hull at 11:40 on February 22nd, doing the inventory that Jim was doing. Operation Junction City did not find KOSVN. The Central Office for South Vietnam continued directing operations for 8 more years. The logistics node the Blackhorse secured was rebuilt within 4 months. None of this was Jim's failure. None of it was Torres's failure, or Nakamura's failure, or Danny Boyle's failure. The fault, when there was fault, lay in strategy and policy, never in the men who fought. Captain Nguyen Thanh Binh survived the war and lived in unified Vietnam until his death in 2009. In interviews with Vietnamese historians in his later years, he spoke of American armor with professional respect, noting that the Blackhorse Regiment's adaptation under fire had demonstrated capabilities his ambush doctrine had not fully anticipated, and that he had subsequently revised his tactical approach based on what the morning of February 22nd had taught him. He never characterized the American soldiers as enemies in any personal sense. He called them professionals doing their jobs in a war whose political foundations neither side had chosen. He was right. War creates professionals on both sides. It creates losses on both sides. Both truths deserve the same weight. Jim showed the ace of spades to his youngest son once, the one who had grown up watching the Benning tree line and eventually followed his father into service. He didn't explain the full morning of February 22nd. He said only, "This is what it looks like to carry something long enough that it becomes part of the weight you walk with." His son, by then a veteran himself, looked at the card and nodded. The jungle doesn't forget. Neither do we. Some things don't require more than that. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real, their courage was real, and what they carried home was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences deserve to be heard. And remember, honor the warriors, question the wars.